Dr. Alan Finkel, Australia's Chief Scientist, and he will deliver MERGA 40's opening address, the M in STEM from a national perspective. On the 25th of January 2016, Dr. Finkel commenced his appointment as Australia's 8th Chief Scientist. Prior to becoming Chief Scientist, he was the 8th Chancellor of Monash University. He was also the 8th President of the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering. So do you see a pattern here with the number 8? And those from Chinese background will know that this is long regarded as the luckiest number in the Chinese culture. So we are very lucky, as is he. Dr. Finkel has an extensive background in science as an entrepreneur, an engineer, a neuroscientist, and as an educator. His PhD was in electrical engineering from Monash University, and then he worked as a postdoc research fellow in neuroscience at the ANU. In 1983, he founded the Silicon Valley, California-based Axon Instruments, making precision scientific instruments for the discovery of new medicines. Axon was sold, and Alan became a director of the acquiring company Molecular Devices. In 2006, he refocused his career in Australia, and among many other roles, he led the amalgamation that formed the Florey Neuroscience Institutes. Alan has won the Clooney's Ross Award for facilitating international neuroscience research and established the Australian course in advanced neuroscience to train early career neuroscientists. He is patron of the Australian Science Media Centre. But importantly for us, Alan has been very committed to education, science education in particular. He co-founded Cosmos magazine, which, in addition to magazine publishing, operates secondary schools' science education programs. While at the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering, he led the development and implementation of STELLAR, S-T-E-L-R, the Science and Technology Education Leveraging Relevance for secondary schools, and it's been adopted in around 500 schools in Australia. For the benefit of our international guests, only a few weeks ago, Alan delivered what's known as the Finkel Report, an independent review into the future security of the national electricity market delivered to the Australian government. There is much optimism in this country that the report will lead to the end of what have been termed the political wars over climate policy that have plagued Australia for a decade. Alan is acutely aware of the role that mathematics plays in the STEM fields, and as a group of mathematics educators, Alan, we very much look forward to what you have to say to us. And at the end of Alan's talk, there'll be a chance to ask questions. So Alan, over to you.
You only need to see one of me. I just wanted to add to what John was saying. As the former Chancellor of Monash University, it's an absolute delight to think that Monash is hosting this significant 40th anniversary of MERGA. And I wanted to pick up on the issue of hardware. John, you were talking about, actually you started off talking about research infrastructure. One of the things that I did last year is I led the planning for the next generation of research infrastructure, things like the Synchrotron in Australia. And one of the things that became uppermost in our minds, and it's very, very present in our report, is that it's much more than just hardware. It's hardware and software. You thought I was going a different way. No, it's hardware, it's software, and it's what we call wetware. It's what's between the ears. It's the fantastic contribution that researchers make to advancing our knowledge. Okay, so I've been invited to give a full speech, and I will. It's your 40th conference, which is a number to celebrate. And not just for the conference. There are 40 squares on a Monopoly board. And 40 in Italian is 40. And 40 days was the duration that ships were forced to wait in harbour in the time of the bubonic plague to stop the spread of the infection. It was the original quarantine. It took 40 attempts to answer most of life's really sticky problems. And the answer is WD-40. To give it its full name, and this is true, its full name is Water Displacement 40th Attempt. And 40 is the highest number that Sesame Street counting has ever reached. So there you have it. It's a milestone, really, whether you're a Muppet or a mathematician. Now, I'm marking a milestone of my own tonight. It's my first formal event since taking off my hat as Australia's chief electrician and resuming my hat as Australia's chief scientist. It also gives me the opportunity to tick off another big item on my bucket list. I'm at a gathering of mathematics researchers, and I'm going to begin with a pop quiz. No calculators, no smartphones allowed. You can take out your pencils. Who am I? I was born in 1820 into a wealthy and well-connected British family. As a child, my hobby was building statistical tables, in which I captured trends in the vegetable output from our garden. At my request, I was tutored in mathematics for 2 hours every day. I became a maths tutor myself before applying for a position as a superintendent in the British Army. I was deployed to the battlefront, where I collected extensive data on soldier mortality rates. This formed the basis of an 850-page report that I published in 1858, saving countless thousands of lives by prompting major reforms in hospital practice. I helped to establish the International Statistical Congress, and I served as a data consultant to the US Army in the American Civil War. I also invented the polar area diagram, and I pioneered the infographic. I was elected to the Royal Statistical Society, and here's a good clue, becoming the first female member at the age of 38. And I died a legend amongst statisticians in 1910. And I am, of course, Florence Nightingale, mathematician. Yes, Florence Nightingale, the lady with the lamp. It could be the lady with the logarithm. She saved far more lives by her grasp of numbers than by her gift for nursing. And she put data at the heart of healthcare as we know it today. So, throw out your textbooks. Because now I'm correcting the record. Florence Nightingale is henceforth the patron saint of mathematics. And I'm paying my personal tribute by drawing out 4 lessons from her story for maths educators today. So, lesson 1, maths is critical. Over the past few months, I've actually done this many times. I've asked audiences to imagine the world without electricity. And you only have to step back 200 years. No electricity, but technology and sophistication were in abundant supply. For example, Britain was benefiting from steam trains and the House of Lords. It was already a life that you here could imagine. But what if we lived in a world without mathematics? Now you have to cast your mind back more than 5,000 years to a world barely crawling from the Stone Age. Take away numbers, and you take away commerce, farming, medicine, music, architecture, cartography, cooking, sport, and every other activity we've invented since 3000 BC, not forgetting electricity. The first thing you looked at today was probably the time. The second was probably the temperature, and the third was probably your hotel bill. There is nothing so disempowering as ignorance of the numbers we need to navigate the world. Never forget that the weakest person in a negotiation is always the person who can't add up in their head. If I had my time, we would go back. If I had my way, we would go back in time and reverse the letters in STEM. Maths first. Maths as the language of science. Maths as the language of progress. Maths as the prerequisite of learning for life. But maybe I wouldn't stop there. Maybe I would abandon the acronym entirely. I consulted on this point with a Year 12 student on a work experience placed in my office just this last week. And Julia tells me that amongst students, it's still just as it was. There's maths and science. The word STEM has never been mentioned in her school. Science and maths, they're still good words. But let me continue to lesson 2. Learning maths, it's hard. It's hard in the sense that it demands our early persistence. Learning in maths is a continuum, always building the next lesson on the skills mastered in the lessons before. To fall behind is often to stay behind, and to drop out in school is to kneecap your opportunities later in life. It is very hard to retrofit the lost lessons into students' brains after they start university, and you all know that too well. Like learning English, kids need to start maths early and keep going. Now, I understand the temptation in schools to lighten the content in the maths curriculum, in the dubious belief that easy things are more attractive to students, and that any maths is surely better than no maths. I also understand the incentives that lead students to study maths at a lower level than their true ability. But a lighter load is really a heavier burden. It is the burden of low expectations. Florence Nightingale, she understood this reality from an early age. She did not consider herself to be naturally gifted in mathematics, but she did believe that she had the capacity to learn. And so she refused to settle for the level of maths education thought fitting for girls at that time. She demanded from her parents the support to raise herself to something higher, something that would make it possible to participate fully in public life. She should be our model for the education of all students, regardless of gender, postcode, cultural background, or family income. And surely, the most effective way to raise expectations in schools is to start at the end point in the education continuum with universities. That is, implement maths prerequisites in all the courses that need a grasp of mathematics. At a stroke, we would signal to principals at primary and secondary level that they simply can't afford to drop the ball. Maths has got to be a priority for every student from kindergarten to graduation. But that brings me to lesson 3, which is that compulsion is not enough. Some children seem to fall in love with maths at birth, and like Florence, they're hungry to be taught. Others, they need help to turn an arranged marriage with mathematics into a genuine passion. And that is the role of the teacher, to make a subject not just compulsory, but compelling. But of course, it is very difficult for any teacher to inspire a passion that they don't feel themselves. And it's also extremely disrespectful to the profession to assume that just anyone can teach maths, as long as they stay at least one lesson ahead of the students in the class. Maths teachers should, in the first instance, be experts at maths. It's that simple, and yet it seems that hard. In far too many schools, out-of-field teaching remains the norm. Peer networks are thin, and professional development is almost an impossible dream. We seem locked in a cycle of poor outcomes and diminishing expectations, passing on to each generation of students, teachers and parents the frustration that we feel ourselves. Entrenched practices are hard to break, and they are demoralising to report. But just because the problems run deep does not mean that we should shy from solving them. And that brings me to my final lessons from Florence. Using evidence to make a difference. Now imagine the situation that Florence Nightingale confronted in the Crimea. Everyone knew that in a war, soldiers get shot. And everyone knew that people who are shot, they tend to die. But what they didn't know was that the vast majority of deaths in the Crimean War, they weren't caused by wounds at all. They were caused by diseases like cholera and typhus. And thus the military leaders didn't implement the basic sanitary precautions in field hospitals and military barracks that would save lives by stopping the spread of disease. Florence Nightingale, she saw the problem, but she needed her own ammunition. So she counted the dead, she collected the data, and she displayed it in a polar area diagram. It was a credible, clear, and compelling display of the causes of death. And suddenly, the problem was no longer too abstract to ignore. It was fixable. And that is how a woman, a nurse, took on the top brass of the British military and won. So think of Florence Nightingale the next time you feel that arguing for education reform is like the charge of the Light Brigade, riding nobly into the valley of death. Evidence can give decision makers in all these communities the impetus and the confidence to act. But it can only do so if we present it in an actionable form. It cannot be just a statement of problems, and it cannot be just a statement of demands. It has to be written and read as a statement of opportunities. In all my dealings with politicians, the education sector, industry and parents, I do sense an enormous will to change. And your research can be the springboard that they need. But the springboard has to be fabricated from evidence and incorporate solutions. And it has to be fabricated to minimise the side effects that might cause it to break. Now, before I finish, I'd like to leave the specific world of mathematics and return briefly to the broader world of maths and science and their embodiment in engineering and technology. Two examples from my work as Chief Scientist. And some of you will know of these projects either as participants or supporters. The first is a project that is on the cusp of realisation. On my first day in the job last year, I was handed a thick book, and it was called the STEM Program Index, or the SPI Guide. And it was a list of extracurricular programs available to students through third-party providers such as firms and universities. It was a good idea, and it patched a faulty connection, the link between the providers and the students. But it was a patch of limited use. Being a printed book, the medium limited the message. It was time-consuming to search. It was a one-way communication with no capacity for feedback from the students. And of course, it was out of date even before we hit the print button. And it would be very expensive to hit the print button again. The solution was obvious, an online portal. It would turn a temporary patch into a living two-way link. The model is TripAdvisor or Airbnb. The challenge, to build it, test it and resource it. And inspired by that challenge, we brought together a network of corporate sponsors, Telstra, BHP Billiton Foundation and the Commonwealth Bank, and organisational backers, the Department of Industry, Science and Innovation, AMSI, and I can say thank you, Jeff Prince, and Engineers Australia. We gave it a new name, the STAR Portal. Sounds good. It's now in widespread testing and it's almost ready to launch. We expect to go live in late July, so it's now at the watch this space timing. Please give us feedback when you see it. The STAR Portal project opened our eyes to another opportunity to help industry providers to be more strategic with their resources and efforts. We have anecdotal evidence that students and firms can both benefit from well-structured and targeted programs, but we have not collected the evidence systematically or filtered it back into program development. So industry providers are constantly reinventing the wheel. Other interested providers are deterred by the fact that they simply don't know how to be effective. How could we empower them to act and channel their enthusiasm in the most optimal way? The COAG Education Council had the same concern, and they called for a national STEM industry partnerships forum to find out. And the forum, which I chair, met for the first time in Parliament House in May. The first task is to take stock of the current programs and their outcomes, and that will be presented at our next meeting in a few months' time. We will then be able to determine whether our ingoing assumptions about industry programs are correct and base future investments on a far more solid foundation. Evidence in place of intuition. Florence would be proud. Indeed, a toast to Florence Nightingale, the lady with the logarithm, and a toast to MERGA as it enters its 40th year. Let's remind this country there's strength in numbers. Let's commit to starting maths education early, to keeping it going, to treating our education system as a continuum, to keeping the bar of student aspirations high, to helping the students clear the bar, to fighting the incumbency bias, and above all, to taking our research beyond observations into the realm of solutions. Enjoy your conference. Thank you.